Hi, everybody. We are back. In this segment, we are going to talk about a source of market failure known as asymmetric information and two problems associated with asymmetric information known as adverse selection and moral hazard. Adverse selection and moral hazard are, I think, really important issues, especially if you're analyzing things like insurance markets. So we're going to talk a lot about car insurance, health insurance. Asymmetric information is also a problem in product markets, markets for goods and services, as well as financial markets. So we will talk about a couple examples relative to those as well. First and foremost, let's define what asymmetric information is. In a very general sense, economists use this term asymmetric information to really refer to a situation where one party in a transaction is privy to some private information that the other party does not have access to or is not privy to. Meaning, in one sense, one party is able to observe some characteristic that the other party finds to be unobservable. And we're going to think about kind of isolating or distilling this idea down into two particular situations with respect to market transactions. We're going to first look at a situation where the seller knows something the buyer does not, which I will refer to here as a situation that we'll call seller side private information. Here, the seller observes a characteristic that is unobservable to the buyer. And the flip side of that coin is a situation where the buyer knows something that the seller does not. And we will refer to this one very creatively as buyer side private information, whereby the buyer is able to observe some characteristic about the nature of the transaction that is unobservable from the seller's perspective. So let's go through a couple examples. We'll start off with an example in a product market, and we'll look at an example here in example one regarding some seller side private information in the market for used vehicles. In the market for used automobiles, and if you've ever had a chance to purchase a used automobile, you'll know this struggle very intimately. But the seller of a used car is going to have more information regarding the quality of that vehicle that they own in comparison to that potential buyer. Right, the buyer is not able to observe how the seller had driven the vehicle or how the seller had maintained the vehicle, whether or not they were doing scheduled maintenance in routine intervals. So the seller here absolutely has some private information the buyer does not. The seller knows to what extent they had driven the car roughly or forcibly. Right, erratic driving, is going to cause the car to depreciate at a much higher rate than if you are driving it gently. The seller also knows, again, to what extent there was proper upkeep on that vehicle, right? Were they getting oil changes at proper intervals? Were they replacing tires and rotating at proper intervals? Were they engaging in standard upkeep and repair? So the seller may or may not provide any such record to the buyer of their upkeep, and is certainly not necessarily obligated to by law, making the quality screening on the buyer's end quite a bit of a struggle, quite a bit of a challenge, as you will know if you purchase a used vehicle. In an attempt to try to screen the quality, the buyer can try to purchase things like a Carfax report or a TrueCar report, which I'm going to argue here provides at best an imperfect signal of any given vehicle's underlying quality issues. Okay, so you might be familiar with the Carfax report, which provides some data on a vehicle's history in terms of accidents, service, and owners, as well as you can see here, they're reporting even the odometer reading. Okay, and the reason why I'm using this term imperfect signal is because just because a car has a good Carfax report, it's got a clean history, doesn't necessarily mean it's a good vehicle. Right? There could be unreported damage, for example. And just because a Carfax vehicle history report says that a car was in an accident doesn't necessarily mean that it is a bad quality vehicle if repairs were done properly. So the point being here, despite the fact we can get this type of report from Carfax or from TrueCar, There are good quality vehicles with questionable vehicle histories, and there are poor quality vehicles that may have clean records. And no rational seller that's trying to pawn off a low quality car that we often refer to as a lemon, no seller trying to pawn off a lemon will willingly admit that the car is a junker if they are rational, because they're going to risk getting a reasonable price for that vehicle. And again, this makes screening for lemons difficult, right? And that's what the consumer wants to do. They want to try to screen for quality of vehicles. So, from the buyer's perspective, the buyer is able to observe the distribution of the price quality data. So if you go to if you go to TrueCar, you can pull up some information that looks like this diagram on the right-hand side. You'll notice this is showing us 127 sales for a 2013 Honda Accord sedan. Okay, so it's showing us here a histogram distribution of how those sales are distributed. And we can see along the horizontal axis here, all right, as we move to the in the right direction, okay, we're dealing with higher quality, higher priced vehicles here. And as we move in the left direction, we're looking at lower priced vehicles that are potentially of lower quality. So the buyer is able to observe this entire distribution of price quality data. But the problem is when you go to a used car lot or you go to someone's home to look at that particular automobile, you do not know specifically where any particular automobile will fall within this particular distribution. I don't know if it's going to be here. I don't know if it's going to be here, right? Or is it right at the average? We don't really know, okay, as the consumer, but we know what the average is and we know what the general distribution looks like. Okay, so typically the consumer then has to formulate their opinions of the vehicle based off of this publicly available information, based off really the characteristics of the average car of that particular make and model. The seller, on the other hand, has a much better idea of where his or her particular used vehicle may fall on this spectrum in terms of its relative positioning in the quality price distribution. So perhaps a consumer thinks, the vehicle, let's say, falls over here. They think they're getting an above average vehicle in terms of quality, but the problem is the seller's vehicle actually falls on the lower end of that spectrum, which the consumer cannot actually observe, but the seller does. And the seller is very happy, right, to interact with a consumer that believes the vehicle is above market quality, because they're going to wind up getting a way higher price than they should have, given that the buyer is unable to screen or observe that particular characteristic, the quality of the vehicle. Let's move on to another example where we will deal with some buyer side asymmetric information in the market for car insurance. So this is an insurance market, not really a good or service market here, a product market. But a potential buyer in the market for automobile insurance is aware of their own driving habits, right? If you're a good driver or a bad driver. And if you don't know, if you're wondering at this point, I will tell you, you're probably in the bad category. If you don't know, probably you're not a great driver. But here's the point. You have some idea of your own driving risk. If you're low risk, if you're, in the middle, and if you're a bad driver that tends to speed a lot, doesn't wear their seatbelt, changes lanes without, signaling, which category you're in. Unfortunately, the seller of the auto insurance policy does not know which category a potential buyer falls into, because that driver's risk, right, their individual risk from their own driving behavior, this is an unobservable characteristic from the perspective of the seller of the insurance policy. Okay, that being said, the seller isn't totally blind. Okay, they have statisticians and actuaries that go out and collect data, and they understand the overall distribution of risks across drivers with different observable characteristics, right? They can observe your age. They know how old you are through your driver's license, your DMV record. They can use that to figure out how much driving experience you have. They know your vehicle type. You have to report that when you buy insurance. And the seller has access to some DMV history from the Department of Motor Vehicles. So the seller isn't totally blind. They can still observe this bell-shaped curve of your distribution of risk. They know there's not a few really high-risk people. There's a few really high-risk people. There's a few really low-risk people, but most folks are in the middle. But again, the problem is as follows. The seller, despite being able to observe the overall distribution of risks, still cannot tell whether a particular driver falls within one category or another. They cannot tell where a particular driver falls under that distribution, again, because the individual's driving risk or their driving behavior is an unobservable characteristic from the seller's perspective. So you'll notice there's a lot of elements that are very similar in example 2 compared to example 1. Right? There's some party that's trying to screen some characteristic which is unobservable, and the other party is able to observe it, but is not really incentivized to reveal it. You do not want to reveal that you are a bad driver if you are sitting at the insurance office trying to write a policy. So what is the seller able to do here? Well, the seller can access a particular driver's DMV history, which again, I'm going to argue provides at best an imperfect signal of any given driver's accident risk. So over here in the right diagram, we have a picture of a fairly clean DMV record. Okay. So the insurance agent, right, the person writing the policy is able to access this information. So they get some information about your driving record, but they don't have all of it, right? For example, the reason why the driving record is an imperfect signal is because there are some good drivers that do get speeding tickets, but who are actually generally really low risk. Okay, maybe this only happened once in their entire lifetime. Conversely, there are bad drivers that are really good at not getting caught breaking traffic laws. So they are speeding. They are doing things they shouldn't be on the road, but they haven't been effectively monitored by law enforcement, meaning that information is not going to show up on their DMV record, on their DMV history, which is why the DMV record, again, provides an imperfect signal, okay, of actual driver risk, right? No bad driver, if they're rational, would ever admit that they are a bad driver, putting themselves in that high-risk category and then being subject to being charged a much higher premium for that insurance product. And so this does make screening difficult from the perspective of the seller of that insurance policy. Now, let's assume here for the moment, we're going into some more detail, that the premium an insurer charges is an increasing function of an individual's risk type. So if you're high risk and the insurance company knows that, they will try to charge you a higher premium because it will cost that insurance company more to pay out your coverage than a low risk person who will be charged a lower premium according to a lower cost from the perspective of the insurance company. The goal of the insurer in this regard is really to engage in some form of what is called price discrimination, which you should see in some material that was covered on monopolies, and engaging in price discrimination, which is the idea of treating individuals differently, treating buyers differently with respect to how you price them, right? Some buyers get higher prices, some buyers get lower prices, so on and so forth. And the goal of the insurer is really to price discriminate in a very aggressive way, where high-risk individuals are being charged a higher premium, lower-risk individuals are being charged a lower premium, medium-risk individuals are being charged a medium premium. And if the insurer hypothetically did know exactly what everybody's risks are, if they had perfect information here, okay, and could observe everybody's risks precisely, okay, then what would that pricing scheme look like? Well, it would almost look like every single person gets their own unique, individualized price. Okay, if there's 1 million people, you would see approximately 1 million different prices, right? Everybody gets a different price according to the risk, assuming that nobody's driving risk is exactly identical here. So each individual under the scheme is charged a totally unique premium according to their own risk category. And this is, again, under the hypothetical situation here, that is if the firm, right, had access to this perfect information, which it does not. Okay, unfortunately, the seller does not have this information as it is an unobservable feature here. Okay, so let's not forget that. It is absolutely still an unobservable feature to the seller, but the thinking about the perfect information case is kind of useful in thinking about what the seller would do if it had that information, if it knew the risk categorization of a given individual who's sitting in front of them trying to buy a policy. So to be clear here, the reality is that the seller is information constrained. They do not have this perfect information. They don't have this perfect ability to slice up the population of buyers into very small individual groups of just one individual and price those individuals uniquely. Okay, that being said, the seller, again, is not blind, right? They do have this actuarial data, which lets them observe the distribution of risk. And again, despite the knowledge of a driver's observable characteristics, right, their age, their car type, their DMV history, those observable characteristics are imperfect information and doesn't allow for the seller to engage in this personalized pricing scheme that we had discussed in the previous slide. That's sometimes referred to as first-degree price discrimination, when you're charging every single person a different price on every unit that they buy. Here's a scenario that we want to think about now. Okay, the seller can't break everybody down individually and identify them individually according to the risk types. But what they can do is they can group people that have similar observable features into what is called a risk pool. And within this risk pool, we will again have high risk individuals to the right, and we will have lower risk individuals to the left for a given risk pool. So again, they're not personalized pricing every individual here, but within a particular risk pool, let's say with 16-year-old drivers with 0 years of experience and a clean DMV record, they can find everybody that has those characteristics that's driving a particular model of car, and they can put them in a pool together. And even within that pool, there will be good drivers and there will be bad drivers. You can't really get away from that due to the fact that these observable characteristics are an imperfect piece of information. And the idea now is that rather than personalizing each individual's premium separately, the insurance company is a little bit coarser and can only personalize groups of individuals together by pricing everyone in the same risk pool accordingly. Okay, so the idea being drivers in a low risk pool would be paying lower premiums and drivers in higher risk pools would be paying higher premiums. Okay, so within a given risk pool, the insurer is charging everyone the same premium within that pool. Okay, insurance is charging everybody the same premium within a given risk pool. And with more information, what can the insurer do? Well, with more information, the insurer can cut up that risk pool into smaller groups and get closer to that personalized pricing scheme. Okay. Usually, though, within a particular risk pool, the premium is based off of the average risk assessment in that pool, where the average risk individual is right in the middle of this distribution. Okay, so let's think about now a couple different examples, and we're going to revisit this idea of a risk pool in the context of the health insurance industry in just a moment. And what we're going to see here is that when the insurance company charges a premium based off of the average risk or based off of the median risk, what they're going to wind up doing is breaking this risk pool up into two sets of folks. Folks that are actually paying less than what they would have had their risk type been revealed as high risk, and folks that are going to wind up paying more than they would have if they were a low risk individual had their risk type be revealed. Now, why don't you just say, hey, look at me, I'm low risk, charge me a lower premium and reveal your risk type if you're low risk? Well, the insurer has no incentive to believe you because a high risk individual has the incentive to misrepresent themselves as a low risk individual in the same way. And there's nothing the insurer can really do to screen that, given that the risk type in terms of your driving behavior is an unobservable feature from their perspective. Okay, let's move on to another example here. That is the example 3, which refers to financial markets example. So this is a situation where there's some seller-side private information in capital markets. And here the narrative is as follows. The CEO or the management of a company understands very intimately the types of financial risks and business risks that the company is taking on. Okay, the problem is these risks are generally unobservable to a potential investor of equity, to a potential buyer of stock, that are not there on the floor of the factory, that are not there in closed-door management meetings, witnessing the day-to-day decision-making by management and employees. Okay, so again, the CEO, the management, they're able to observe the financial risks, but investors are not. This is an unobservable from their perspective. You might say, well, savvy investors will do things like read company financials. But again, doing this, reading the company financials, that income statement, statement of cash flows, balance sheets, that provides at best an imperfect signal of the company's true risks. And if you take accounting, you'll learn there's a lot of wiggle room in accounting, and the management is responsible for putting together those financial statements, and they're incentivized to maybe make things look as good as possible, subject to not violating any legal constraints on the accounting side. So again, this is very similar, right? A lot of similar features here, example 3 compared to example 2 and 1. Okay, there's some unobservable characteristic that the other party knows, okay, but the party to whom that characteristic is unobservable can get some imperfect piece of information, right? Like that Carfax report in the case of the market for used autos, or the DMV record in the case of markets for auto insurance policies. Investors are also able to observe the statistical distribution of risk, right? You can go onto Yahoo Finance, you can look up the distribution of returns for all these different companies, and you can get an idea of what the overall distribution of risk looks like. But again, the problem is an investor is not able to predict where a particular company is generally going to fall underneath that distribution in the future. Is that company high risk? Is it medium risk? Is it low risk? They don't really know, but they can observe the entire distribution of risk across that bell-shaped curve here. Okay, so this was a capital markets example. We saw a product market, right? Market for goods, cars. We saw an insurance market example here. Here's a financial market example. I'm going to jump back to the insurance market. We're going to talk specifically about the market for health insurance, for healthcare. And in this market, I'm going to argue it is also a case of some buyer side asymmetric information, right? The buyer of a health insurance policy knows the types of health risks they take. They know if they're a smoker or not. They know if they drink or do drugs. They know how they eat, how they exercise, what their family history is, how often they maintain themselves by going to the doctor, etc. Okay, problem is, and the asymmetry comes into play here, is that the health risks are generally unobservable to the seller of the health insurance policy. Now you might say, oh, well, I have a health insurance policy or a life insurance policy, and my insurer required me to get a doctor's report, a doctor's visit, before they would sign off on my policy. And again, just like the DMV record, just like the Carfax report, just like company financials, that doctor's visit is a report that provides, at best, an imperfect signal, an imperfect piece of information with respect to the true nature of a potential buyer's health risks. That being said, the health insurers, like the car insurers, like the used car buyers, they are not completely blind here. They are able to observe the statistical distribution of the health risk for a pool of individuals with similar pre-existing conditions and medical histories. Right, so we can observe, again, that bell-shaped distribution. We know in a given year on average how many people die from a sickness, how many sick people there are, how many healthy people there are. We know this on average statistically, right? We know that distribution, but the problem is when somebody walks into our office to buy a health insurance policy from us, we do not know where that person falls on that distribution, whether or not they're a healthier person that's lower risk, or maybe a sicker person with a pre-existing condition that is higher risk. Okay, so you'll notice all 4 of these examples had some very common elements. Okay, first, there was always one agent that could observe the distribution of a potential characteristic with publicly available information, but they couldn't tell which individuals fell into that distribution in which location. Okay, right? We know on average how many sick people and how many healthy people are out there, but when a person walks in to buy insurance, we do not know whether they're sick or healthy. We know there are good drivers and bad drivers and okay drivers out there, but I don't know if the person standing in front of me trying to sign a policy is a good, bad, or mediocre driver. Right? So the other element we have here is that the agent with the private information is able to observe both the overall distribution as well as where a particular element falls in that overall distribution. Okay, so that is the general environment here of asymmetric information. And I'm going to go ahead and use the healthcare or the health insurance example to think about this problem known as adverse selection. And we'll talk about the Affordable Care Act as an application of this idea. So the first problem with asymmetric information we're going to discuss today is something called adverse selection. And you might be thinking, well, what does adverse mean? Is that risk aversion? It's not averse, it's adverse. Adverse means bad. Selection means choice. And it turns out this is a situation where the market winds up making a bad choice for us, but let's elaborate on that. And again, I'll do this in the context of the health insurance example. And what we're going to look at on the right here is a risk pool for a particular group of folks, let's say with the same medical history, same set of pre-existing conditions, similar age range. Okay, they're all pooled together. And within that pool, there are healthier folks that are lower risk, and there are sicker folks that are higher risk. Okay, so within this pool, there is still variation in risk. That's important here. Okay, and let's suppose that the health insurer bases the premium in the pool based off of that average risk and charges this to everybody in the same risk pool. So even though you're healthier, okay, you're going to be charging a premium based on the average, knowing that higher risk folks in your pool are pulling that average up. Okay, that is the trick. So the premium in this case looks like it would be right here, right? It's based off of the average risk. So let's suppose on that x-axis, we're also measuring the premium, which is an increasing function of risk. They are proportional to one another. Now, as I mentioned earlier, okay, when the insurer does this, what they wind up doing is they effectively divide that risk pool into two groups. Okay, they're dividing that risk pool into two different groups. First, there is this group with above average risk that would have been paying a higher premium if their true risks were revealed. Okay, those are all the folks above the average, which means they're falling on the right side of this distribution. Okay, I'm going to argue that for these folks in the pool, being charged according to the average is actually a great deal for them. Okay, because if they weren't, their willingness to pay for that, if it's reflective of their actual risk, is much higher, right? So now you can argue that they would have been willing to pay more knowing that they were high risk, but they're now getting away paying less given that they are low risk, meaning they're getting a positive consumer surplus and hence are definitely incentivized to purchase this insurance. Okay, so it is a great deal for people over in the right side of this distribution. Conversely, and hopefully you see where I'm going with this, the other group of folks involves those in the left half of this picture. Okay, and those are individuals with below average risk that would have been willing to pay a much lower premium if, again, their true cost or their true risk type were actually revealed to the insurer. Okay, so their willingness to pay is much lower. And if we try to charge them a higher amount than that, if they're in that category there on the left, okay, then being charged the average, or that average is being pulled up by higher risk individuals that are less healthy in your risk pool. Okay, this means that the buyers that are low risk are essentially being charged a premium that is higher than their willingness to pay if they were to have their own risk type revealed as low risk. And if your willingness to pay is lower than what you're being charged, you would be getting negative consumer surplus. And we know that if you have the freedom to participate in the market, if you would get a negative piece of economic pie and negative consumer surplus, you could always do better by getting zero surplus and just backing off, leaving that market and not purchasing the product at all. Okay, so it is a bad deal for people with below average risk based on how that premium has segmented this risk pool here. So again, those lower risk individuals, are they going to stick around and purchase the insurance if they have the freedom to avoid it? The answer here is no, provided they have the freedom to avoid it. Now, in some markets, you don't have this freedom. For example, in the market for car insurance, if you want to drive legally in the United States, the government forces you to purchase insurance. Okay, so sometimes you may not have that freedom. And if you don't, then what do? Well, you buy less coverage than what you should have. You suboptimally insure yourself. You buy less coverage than what you should have. Or if you do have the freedom to not buy it, then you may wind up exiting the risk pool entirely. So let's assume that's the extreme case here, where all of these healthy people now recognize their lower risk, that premium is being charged based off of the average risks. There are sicker people pulling that average up. And suppose all of the healthy people decide to leave the market and not buy that health insurance product anymore. So now they're gone. Okay, well, if those people are not there anymore, think about what happens to the average risk. It's not in the same place anymore, is it? If we've eliminated all the folks in the left end of this particular distribution, right? If we've gotten rid of everybody over here in this range, okay, then that must cause the average risk in that pool now to go up, since the remaining folks are all less healthy, higher risk individuals. So when these folks exit the risk pool, when the low risk individuals, when those healthy individuals leave, this causes the risk premium tied to this pool to actually increase. It goes up a little bit. Okay, now you'll notice, oh, well, it looks like when that happens, we've now created those two groups again of winners and losers, of folks that's a great deal for to be averaged in, and folks that it is not such a great deal for to be averaged in. So we could, again, make a very similar argument here, right? Lower risk individuals in the red region, even at this higher premium now, they are not going to stick around to take that bad deal, provided, again, they have that freedom to avoid it. Okay, so if that is the case, and they do wind up exiting the risk pool as it happened in the last iteration, okay, then what's going to happen here? Well, same thing. When these folks exit the risk pool, the average risk is going to increase even higher, and this is going to push the premium up even more. Okay, that premium goes up even more. And you will hear economists refer to the term that the market unravels in this situation. And that's what's happening here. You'll notice every time the low types leave, this pushes the premiums up. There are fewer folks that are going to be insured. Okay, and the folks that are exactly the folks that the insurers do not want to really be insuring. They're the higher risk individuals, which are going to cost the insurers a lot more money to cover. Okay, so the following logic here that we've been using, it reveals the market's tendency under asymmetric information to really serve only the highest risk individuals. Okay, and again, these are exactly the types of insurance, the types of individuals that the insurance company wants to avoid solely serving, right? If there's a bunch of healthy people in there pulling down the average, then that's a little bit more profitable for the insurance company to be able to take on higher risk folks. But if all the healthy people leave, they're going to need to compensate by raising premiums on everybody who is left. Now, this is a problem here, this selection problem, adverse selection, where the market is choosing the riskiest type to participate. This is what we call an ex-ante problem in economics. This is a problem before any risk is shifted to a third party, before any insurance is purchased, and before any health outcome is really known, okay, where the insurance payment will be relevant. So again, this problem is referred to as adverse selection, and it literally means bad choice. Okay, the market is choosing the least attractive risk type to participate, right? Only the high risk type is going to wind up inside that insurance pool if the low types are able to leave. Okay, so the prediction here is as the low types leave, that premium going to get pushed up even more. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about just an application here. Thinking about the Affordable Care Act, okay, the ACA, also known as Obamacare, and there's a core component of the ACA referred to as the individual mandate. You might be aware of what this is, but the individual mandate was a rule that forced everybody to have health insurance, or at the end of the year when you filed taxes, you got paid a fairly stiff fine for not doing so. Okay, and in theory, I think the idea was beautiful, but a lot of folks argue that it is, was poorly implemented, that the penalty wasn't high enough to force people into the pools. But the idea here was that if we force everybody to purchase insurance, that means we will also force healthy people who otherwise would have exited, who would have been gone. Okay, we will force them to purchase insurance now. And if we can force the low types back into the risk pool, this will cause the premiums to start to drop. Okay, so in theory, this was a nice idea. Was it executed perfectly? A lot of economists think not. Now, the premium's lowered, right? Then it's going to be more reflective of the average risk in that pool, and we're forcing those low risk healthy people to essentially take that bad deal. That's what's happening here. And this is where there was a big aversion. I think a lot of folks, conservative folks on the right end of the political spectrum, were complaining, oh no, this kills my freedom, this hurts my freedom. And in that regard, they were referring to the freedom to be able to exit out of this risk pool and not be forced to purchase insurance. And they said this was an unprecedented move by the government, despite the fact that every day, the government makes you have car insurance if you are going to drive. It forces you to buy car insurance to be legal. So this wasn't really an unprecedented move in that regard, but there was quite a bit of aversion to it. It is no surprise that after Congress snuck in a repeal of the individual mandate in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, which was just supposed to be about tax cuts, but they snuck in this key provision at the end that said, hey, we're going to go ahead and repeal that individual mandate, but don't worry, every other part of the Affordable Care Act will stay there. But the problem is the individual mandate was really the heart of what helped the Affordable Care Act function. It was forcing those low types back into that risk pool, driving premiums down and keeping them from rising more than they would otherwise. So it was no surprise that shortly after the individual mandate was repealed through the TCJA, premiums did start to increase more than they had in previous years under the previous administration. Now, what can we learn from adverse selection? What does this really tell us about markets? Well, we know that it tells us that low types generally will not be in there. Okay, we're going to wind up serving the high types, and the high types are going to be the most eager to seek coverage, given that they benefit from that premium being pulled down by the presence of lower types. So when things like the market for used autos, adverse selection tells us that the lowest quality cars are the ones that sellers are most eager and likely to sell. Okay, you're most likely to come across a lemon in that market. In the market for car insurance, it tells us that those individuals who are most eager to purchase insurance coverage are probably the higher risk drivers. Okay. The highest risk drivers are going to be most eager to purchase insurance, and lower risk drivers, conversely, will underinsure. Right, since exiting the market entirely is illegal if you drive in the US. What does this tell us about capital markets? Well, it tells us that the CEO with the riskiest opportunity is going to be the most aggressive in trying to recruit your capital by selling you an equity share in their company. So you're going to see the riskiest opportunities showing up in financial markets. And if you don't care about risk, fine. If you're trying to look for that portfolio growth, get a high return, maybe that's great. Okay, what about health insurance markets? Well, it says in the market for health insurance, the least healthy people are going to be the ones showing up in those risk pools. And they will be the ones most eager to purchase coverage, while the healthy individuals will try to underinsure and will try to leave that risk pool now that it is legal for them to do so under the repeal of that individual mandate. So let's go ahead and talk specifically about the nature of market failure associated with adverse selection. Okay, I'm going to argue here that adverse selection is a market failure associated with the prevention of mutually beneficial trades. Okay, if the insurer knew what risk category you were, and you knew that the insurer knew, then you're willing to pay a low premium if you're a low type, and they'll charge you a low premium if you're a low type, and there's no problem. We can make that mutually beneficial trade. Conversely, if you're a high type, and they know you're a high type, and you know that they know, then they're willing to charge you a high price, and you know that's fair because you are a high type. So if everybody knows that unobservable feature, if it's observable to both parties, there's no more asymmetric information and there's no more market failure, and all those mutually beneficial trades would happen. But if you consider the case, for example, of the buyer side private information, right, where there are low risk types that would have been willing to trade or purchase insurance had they been charged a fairer premium according to their risk types and not pooled in with the riskier types that pull that premium up, okay, then the fact that those individuals leave means them being pooled in, right, and averaged with the higher types. That is preventing those mutually beneficial trades from happening at the low end of that spectrum. So adverse selection does imply missing out on trades that would have been mutually beneficial under perfect information if everybody knew what everyone's risk types were. Okay, so again, the pooling of risk types creates this incentive that does prevent mutually beneficial trades. Okay, we could also think about this on the seller side. Okay, if we consider that used car market, right? A buyer may have been willing to pay for an average quality car at an average price point. But if they fear that they're being sold a lemon, which they cannot tell because they know that the seller has that private information, then a buyer may back out on a fair deal, even if it is a good car and they're being charged a fair price, because they have some expectation that it could be a lemon. So mere knowledge of this information asymmetry, okay, mere knowledge of that asymmetry could disincentivize a mutually beneficial trade from taking place if the party that does not observe the characteristic does not hold a good belief about the nature of the transaction. Now let's go ahead and talk about moral hazard. We'll wrap up. Moral hazard is a different type of problem related to asymmetric information. It's really an ex post problem that occurs after you shift the risk to a third party in an insurance market, or after, let's say, you shift the financial risk to another party when you sell them stock in your company. Right now, the other party's on the hook. You're not on the hook as much. And the idea is as follows. Once an individual purchases some insurance, or once an individual shifts some risk to a third party, what essentially happens is this creates a type of negative externality environment where now the individual, after shifting risk away from themselves, can behave badly. They can behave riskier, and they don't pay the full cost. They don't face the full consequence of that decision anymore, in that some of that consequence is now going to be absorbed by a third party, the insurer. Okay, so the change in incentives that often results in riskier behavior once you shift that risk away is what moral hazard is. And the market failure associated with moral hazard is related to negative externalities. Individuals do too much of the action relative to what is socially efficient after they shift that risk to a third party. Right? They take too much of that risky action because they do not face the full consequences of that action anymore. So if somebody else is going to be willing to pay the cost, you're willing to do that a little bit more. And that's the idea. So when you shift the risk away, your incentive is changed and you can afford to take somewhat riskier behavior. So a lot of examples we could talk about here. So what does moral hazard tell us about the car insurance industry? Well, it tells us that when you buy car insurance, it actually may make you a worse driver. Okay, this may incentivize you to take more risks. You have insurance. You might be willing to speed that last mile to work to get there on time, when otherwise you wouldn't have if you didn't know you had that coverage. Okay, another example, if you purchase fire insurance for your home, okay, then it turns out, and this is actually statistically verifiable, you are less likely to observe that those individuals would purchase fire extinguishers for the household. And that might sound silly. You're like, oh, they're willing to just let the house burn down and have the insurance company build it over and over again instead of just spending $40 on a fire extinguisher. And the answer is, well, to some degree, yes, because the fire extinguisher is a cost that the homeowner would have to face. But once they shift the risk of the fire to the insurance company, right, that's the risk that the insurance company faces. So there's no incentive for them to do things like buy fire extinguishers or even check smoke detectors at regular intervals to make sure they are working. Okay. I mentioned this before, but when a firm's management sells equity to a shareholder, the burden of the company's financial risks are now shared with that stockholder, right? Hence the term shareholder. Okay, and this shifts the risk away from the firm management in a way that lets them take excessive risks because they know that some of the financial outcome or some of the financial risk is now being borne by this investor, by this shareholder. Similarly, when you purchase health insurance, you are much more likely to make that late night run for fast food, to go to In-N-Out Burger. Okay, you're more likely to engage in bad behavior like smoking or drinking alcohol, which leads to poorer health outcomes later on in life because you've shifted some of that financial risk away to an insurance party, a third party. Okay, so, how do we fix these problems? How do we see these problems being addressed in practice? Well, there's a few ways. There are some methods of reducing the problem of both adverse selection and moral hazard. It turns out with adverse selection, solving these problems really involves being able to effectively screen individuals to identify the risk type or to get individuals to credibly reveal their own risk types. And the problem with moral hazard is typically solved by monitoring individual behavior after that party has been shifted in a way where monitoring bad behavior can result in penalizing that bad behavior. A little bit of carrot and stick, some penalization, some sticks, some punishment if bad behavior is observed. So I'll come back to the moral hazard case in a minute, but many insurance products allow consumers to self-select, means the buyers choose themselves into the terms of the policy, okay, by offering some combination of deductible and premium. And the idea being the deductible is the part of the cost of the insurance. So if let's say you crash your car and there's maybe $5,000 worth of damage and you have $1,000 deductible, okay, that means you're responsible for paying the first $1,000 of the damage that you cause, and then the insurance would cover the remaining $4,000. But if you had $1,000 deductible and you only did $500 worth of damage to your car, then the insurance doesn't pay anything because the amount of damage did not exceed your deductible. So in general, the way this works is that the higher deductible a policy is associated with, the lower the premium that policy is going to charge. And individuals choosing higher deductibles are more likely to actually be low risk individuals because you would not want to choose a high deductible. Okay, if you know you're a bad driver and you expect to get into lots of accidents, you don't want to be paying a bigger share for those accidents. You want to shift that away from yourself. So offering this menu of deductible and premium combinations allows the insurance company to better gauge who's actually low risk and who's actually high risk by creating a new characteristic, the choice of deductible, which they can observe, which is credibly tied to your risk features, whether you're high, medium, or low. Again, another thing the deductible does is it helps align the financial incentives of the individual and the insurer ex post, after risk has been shifted, since the deductible is a fraction of the cost that the individual is responsible for before insurance kicks in. So if you have a deductible, that means when you crash, both you and the insurance company have to pay some money, right? So that aligns your incentives a little bit ex post, after the fact, in a way that would reduce moral hazard. And we can write that in here. And it helps reduce moral hazard by essentially aligning financial incentives a little bit more directly. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about a couple other ways that we've seen these problems fixed. There's been some creative solutions put forth by a couple companies. You might remember this lady here, Flo, from the Progressive commercials. She's pretty funny. But she's holding in her hand here something that is referred to as the snapshot tool. And you might remember this if you watch a lot of TV and you've seen these commercials. But this is a pretty creative solution. Progressive offers this snapshot tool that you can purchase. And the tool essentially is what's known as, it's a type of accelerometer, which is essentially a device with a little weight at the end of a spring. And the more forcefully you drive your car around, if you're taking turns at high speeds, you're slamming on the brakes, you're accelerating really rapidly, okay, that weight is going to pull on that spring a little bit more. And what this device does is it uses this accelerometer to measure how forcefully you drive and transmit that data back to the insurance company. Meaning, if you're actually a high-risk individual and you have this device, the insurance company is going to see that you drive the car like a bad driver. You drive it like a high-risk individual. And this will allow the insurer to better identify you and to better associate you with the correct risk pool related to your actual driving habits. Now, I think the other interesting thing about this tool here is that it also allows the insurance company to effectively monitor your driving behavior as well, almost like they were sitting there, like Flo was sitting there in the passenger seat next to you watching you drive. And again, monitoring your behavior is the solution to moral hazard, making sure that once that risk is shifted, you're not doing something that you shouldn't be. Okay, and again, if you are identified as high risk, okay, this is going to result in you being moved to a higher risk pool and being charged a higher premium. All right, so I'm going to argue the tool not only functions as a monitoring device and reducing the ex post problem of moral hazard, but it also provides another means of screening individuals via self-selection, right? You don't have to buy this tool. You only buy this tool if you want it. And I would argue if you only have two types of drivers, low risk and high risk, okay, the low risk driver is the only one that will want to purchase or self-select into using this device because it will credibly reveal that they are actually low risk and allow them to be moved into a lower premium risk pool. A higher risk driver would not want to purchase this device because it will reveal them to be high risk and will result in moving them to a high risk premium pool. So offering this type of device, this self-selection mechanism here, actually creates what is called a type of separating equilibrium, where the two risk types actually have an incentive to behave differently, and the insurer can observe that behavior and figure out which type they actually are dealing with. Okay, without that type of mechanism, though, both the low and the high types would want to say that they are low types, right? The high type knows that the insurer can't see that, so they are incentivized to misrepresent themselves. And in the absence of this self-selection mechanism, we wind up in what's called a pooling equilibrium, where all the types behave the same, and you can't really tell who is who. So that wraps up our discussion of asymmetric information. We were able to do that without very much math and with very little game theory formally. So hope that was informative, and I'll see you soon.